Thanks so much for joining me after lunch. Most of you know that my work is in investigations, and most of my work is in cold cases. So my approach to almost everything goes through that lens, right? It's just the nature of when you do this work a lot, everything's going to go through a certain lens. So what I want to do with you today is just talk about how you can use this investigative lens to help in a generation that I think is more and more inclined to take a similar approach. Here's what I mean. What I've discovered as a youth pastor is that young people, Gen Z, those are folks who are like 5 to 20-ish, for the most part want 2 whys for every 1 what. And what I mean by that is that we have a tendency to offer whats. What is true about the Bible? What is true about Jesus? What is true about God? What? When we're raising our kids, we're always giving them a lot of whats. What is true? But I think most young people want 2 whys for every 1 what. The first why is, okay, but why do you think that's true? Like, it's one thing just to say that you believe that something is true, but why? What is that based on? And that's something I think that for the most part, the culture makes a claim and then tells us that it's based on some fact, some piece of evidence, some piece of science. You Christians, you just all believe this stuff blindly, but we've got evidence on this side to support our claim. So I think the first why is it true? The second why, though, is probably more important to young people, and that's why should I care? Okay, maybe that's good for you guys. All people who in their 50s and 60s who come to these conferences are all geeked out on apologetics, but I don't care. How does it affect me? Like, how's it going to change my life tomorrow? So I think that there's 2 whys we have to give young people, and that is, number 1, why is it true? And number 2, why should I care? So what I'm going to do in this first session today with you is talk about the first kind of how would I approach this evidentially. And secondly, in the second session tomorrow afternoon, we'll talk about why it matters at all. I've been having some problems with my clicker, so just be patient with me if it's working. I can't see there is a God. I just proved it. We're going to be talking about some stuff from a book called Forensic Faith. And I only wrote this book because as I started writing books about the evidence for Jesus, the evidence for Christianity, I became a Christian when I was 35. I started to speak about it. Ultimately, I ended up doing the last probably 8 or 9 years. I've been speaking a lot about it. And the first couple of years of doing this, I realized that when I got asked out to a church to talk about the evidence, usually it wasn't the pastor who was asking me to come. It was usually an elder or a deacon who had enough influence with the pastor that he could get the pastor to do something the pastor couldn't give a lick about, because the pastor doesn't care about apologetics. And that was, I realized at some point, I needed to write a book, not a book that makes the case for Jesus or a book that makes the case for God, but a book that makes the case for making a case at all. And that's why I wrote this book. And what I do in this book is try to go through 4 aspects, 4 things that first responders learn to do, and then leverage those toward how we could use those 4 things, because they are pretty evidential. How do we take those 4 approaches and apply them to making the case for Christianity? And today we're going to talk about the last one in this series, which is just how do we communicate this? A lot of what I've learned as a communicator, I learned in jury trials. As a matter of fact, I've been in so many of these. Most of them have been on Dateline, so you've probably seen some of my cases. And all of them have been with this guy, John Lewin. You know the Robert Durst case? You know who Robert Durst is? He killed his wife in New York City. Then he killed a guy in Galveston and cut up his body and tossed it in the bay. Then he killed a woman in Los Angeles. Well, the Los Angeles case was, Los Angeles. So John was involved in that case. I just helped him on the closing. Again, it's about how we communicate the case to a jury that matters. And John, we've been very good friends. He's been highly publicized in the LA Times, on Dateline. He just had that case on 2020 about 2 weeks ago. This is typically what he would say to jurors during closing arguments. He would almost always say something like this: when Detective Wallace brings me a case, he's got the difficult task of releasing it to me for the trial. All the effort he spent investigating and preparing the case for filing, that's complete, that's done. Now he has to hand the case over to me for the jury trial. I know it's difficult for him. It's hard for him to trust me with his hard work. In fact, I bet he still thinks he could have presented the case better than I did. He tells us to the jury, and I always agree with him on this because I could present it better than John. But the next thing John's going to tell the jury, though, is that, now I have to do the same thing with you that Jim did with me. I've done everything I can do over the last 10 weeks to present this case to you, and I have to now release it to you after all that hard work, and you're going to take that case and make a decision. So he experiences the same thing that I experience. He just experiences it one level down. Make sense? So people ask me all the time, so we've never lost a case, and the question then becomes, well, where do you win these cases? What part of this process do you win a case? Well, it's not in the opening statement. That's not where we spend a lot of time in opening statements, usually a couple of hours, sometimes a day in opening statements. But that's not where we win it, and we don't win it, believe it or not, during the evidence presentation of the next 10 weeks. I think Durst took over a year. We had a COVID break in there. So that we don't win it here. We don't actually win it in closing argument. And believe it or not, we don't win it during the deliberation on the case. You win your cases at jury selection, as sad as that is. It turns out that if you pick the wrong jury, you're not going to get to the verdict you're looking for. And everyone knows this on both sides. Both the prosecutor knows this and the defense attorney knows this. Jury selection is what the most important thing we're going to do in communicating any truth claim. That's also true for you and I when we're trying to communicate truth claims about worldview and about Christianity. It turns out picking a jury is the thing that's the most important aspect of your case, yet most of us don't think about it at all when we're communicating this to our friends and family. A lot of what you're doing, you can solve right here. If you feel like I've been sharing this forever, like I'm the only Christian growing up in my family. I didn't grow up as a Christian, and there was no Christians in my family. So when I became a Christian, it was the first one. Well, then you start communicating this to all your friends and family members, right? You ever have trouble with that? Ever find yourself like flat-footed or doesn't seem like you're making any progress? Well, a lot of it is because you aren't taking the time to select your jury to begin with. You would never look, I'm looking for three things when it comes to jurors. Here they are. I'm looking for someone who gives a lick. You got to be passionate. I have had people who have tried very hard to get off of a jury. They'll come in and they've got every excuse in the world not to serve on the jury. Well, we always take those people. We're like, sorry, if you're that passionate, we want you. Okay? Because passion works whether you're passionately for or against, right? The second thing we're looking for is bias. Do we have somebody who's got such a bias? And we'll talk about that in a minute. And the third thing we're looking for is humility. So if you're somebody who thinks you know the answer before you start, you're probably not going to get on a jury. So I'm giving you tips for how to get off your next jury right now. So we have a box, and we're going to have 12 people in the box. We're going to have 4 or 5 alternates. I think we had maybe 8 or 10 alternates on the Durst case. So you have a lot of alternates because these long cases, people get sick, people get hurt, people leave the jury for whatever reason. You need alternates. But you start off with a room full of people. I think we have about 400 on the Durst case. And I think that most of ours, we have about 70 to 100 people who will be called in potentially for jury duty. Because we're not going to use all those people. Clearly, we're going to pick out from that 100, the say 16. Typical murder trial is going to be 12 plus 4. So we're going to pick out 16 jurors from a room of 100. So the question then becomes, how do we select these jurors? Because we can turn some people down. You each have a number of people you can turn down. It depends on the state. I'm in California, so it's a little bit dicier there. So what we do is look at that room, that jury room. There's a spectrum of bias in the room that we're trying to pick from, okay? Largely, the groups can be divided into 2 groups. You have some people who are very much pro-prosecution. They're people who have had a good example of or had a good experience with the law. And then you have people who are pro-defense. And so every jury pool is going to have those kinds of people. Now, these kinds of people can be divided again. So I'll divide them into 4s. So number 1s are people who are they've had such a great experience with the law. They love to watch ID Channel and Oxygen, and they watch all they just love prosecutors. They love Law and Order, Special Investigation Unit, whatever the heck that thing is, which they're all stupid, by the way. But the point is, they love those shows, and they, for the most part, are so convinced that the police are right. They're thinking, hey, if this dude is even here and he's wearing that orange jumpsuit, he's guilty, because to get here took 400 steps. So if you're even in trial and you're a defendant, you're guilty. That's the furthest extreme. You also have people I would call 2s. They are pro-prosecution, but they are reasonable. If you don't have enough evidence to convict, they will not convict. Then you have 3s. These are people, for the most part, have not had a good experience with the law, and they lean toward the defendant just to begin with. Maybe they had somebody in their family who was accused, maybe even falsely accused, so they have a tendency to sympathize with defendants, but they are fair. If there's enough evidence, they will convict. Then you have 4s. These are people who think if a cop is talking, he's lying. The minute it comes out of his mouth, he's a liar. And so these are the spectrum. Now, you can imagine that no prosecutor wants someone from 4. Does this work? No. 4 you don't want if you're a prosecutor. But if you're a defense attorney, you don't want number one. So what are we doing in these kinds of jury selections is we are eliminating the edges. We are getting rid of the ones and fours. And we usually, there's a voir dire process where we will ask you questions. You ever wonder why we're asking you the questions? We're trying to get rid of ones and fours. Now, granted, prosecutors would love to have all twos. And defense attorneys would love to have all threes. And the whole jury selection process is this debate about how many twos and threes are going to get on your jury. Or follow me so far? The reason why I'm showing you this is because it turns out that when we're proclaiming Jesus to the world around us, you sit down on a plane, you're sitting next to somebody, well, the world around us is also divided. It's similar between people who are receptive to the Christian message, maybe they already are Christians, and people who are not. And these two groups can be broken into four as well. So if you look at number ones are people who are so committed to the Christian worldview that if you had the body of Jesus and drug it around in front of them, they would say, don't care, love Jesus, love the idea anyway, I'm still in. It doesn't even have to be true for me to want to be part of it. And there are people like that. Don't need to show me any evidence for this because I'm already in. Don't need the evidence. It's a matter of faith. I have faith. I'm in. Twos are people who are Christians, but they have their days when they're like wondering if there's even a God at all. They have their doubts. Threes are people who are like, yeah, I'm relatively agnostic about this, but I can see why some of you knuckleheads believe this is true. Make sense? And fours are not even, they're like anti-Christians, anti-God people. These are people who don't want this to be true. I think it's actually destructive. When someone says, I hate God, I don't believe in God, and I hate him, they're not saying that they hate something they don't believe in. That's stupid. They're saying that this is something they don't believe in, and they hate the fiction that you do believe in. Because that fiction is destructive. That's fours. So this is the spectrum. If you're on Twitter, that's who you're probably talking to, okay? That's just a hammer looking for a nail. So this is why I always tell people whenever you're sharing Jesus with people in the world around you, it's a 3/4 principle. 3 of these 4 are actually listening to you. The 4th is not. So this is who we're dealing with. It's kind of like your jury selection. And it turns out, was it not loud enough? Oh, no, this is fine. That's okay. So it turns out that this is what you're always dealing with. And I have a strategy for how I deal with each one of these. So you might say, for example, I got a 1 in my, or you're somebody who you probably know people in your own church who are like, I do not care about the evidence for this. This is nothing I need to learn because I'm already in. So don't waste your time with these kinds of conferences, at least for us, because we're already in. Really? Do you have kids? Because they're 2s. If you're lucky, they're 2s. And they don't want my stupid books or Frank's books or any of our books. You can buy those books for your kids. We often are at the book table and they would bring us a book. Can you sign this book for my daughter? She's now in college. She's no longer a Christian. I can sign it. She's not going to read it because it turns out she doesn't want to hear from me. It's not information that changes you. It's relationship connected to information that has all the transformational power. Right now, you have the relationship as the parent, but you don't have the information you need. But I have the information, but I have no relationship. Turns out you read the book because you're the person who needs to deliver that because you are in relationship with that person. So if you're a 1 and you don't think you need the evidence because you already are believing this is true, well, you've got kids, and that's why you need to know how to make the case. Not for you, it's for your kids. And by the way, your kids probably right now, all of your kids, some of you got grown kids, so you already know how this turns out. But right now, statistically, there's a better chance than not that if you've got a teenager in this room, they are really not as committed to this as you are. At the very least, they're not as committed as you are. More likely, they don't even think it's true. They just haven't told you yet. But when they get far enough away, they will start talking about it. This is why we see so many people in high school, in college rather, will report they're no longer Christians. They decided that when they were in junior high school, statistically. They just didn't tell you. They went along with the game. So what do you do? 2s and 3s, of course, are the very people we hope to encounter on a plane, right? Because they're kind of need some support, need to know why it's true, or they are looking to see if anything's true. And those are the people who would respond to when you talk about why this is true evidentially. But what do you do with 4s? So I was a 4 for many years. My dad is still a 4. What do you do with 4s? Well, it's a different strategy for 4s. And by the way, a lot of times you'll just start talking to people. You haven't even assessed where they are on the spectrum. Like you haven't. Have you thought about your own family to say, well, where are they? on this. It's going to change the way you deal with them, don't you think? You just need to know where they are. But if you've got a 4, there's a model we use for this, and it's not to go out and burp out all the stuff you know about Jesus. I do that. Don't get me wrong. I've shared what I know about Jesus with my dad over and over and over again. But the strategy with 4s is that you are going to pray and model Christ for 4s. That's the strategy for 4s. Why? Because it turns out that your good case for Christianity is not going to move them from a 4 to a 3. That's what God does. God does the moving from 4 to 3. So I'm going to pray this guy from 4 to 3, hopefully. And then I'm going to model Christ along the way so the transition is not impeded by my stupidity. So we're going to pray and model, and then once he gets to that 3 position, he's probably going to remember everything you've told him over the last 20 years, at least I hope. Now, we've been taking these immersive trips with students for years where we take students to Salt Lake City if we're going to do a theology trip, or we'll take them to Berkeley, UC Berkeley, which is our kind of like Chapel Hill in North Carolina, which kind of feels like the same way. By the way, it's getting to the point where almost any university that's not explicitly a Christian university, and about a third of those too, are anti-Christian. Isn't that sad? But that's just the nature of it. The closer you are to a coast, as far as a city goes, the more likely you are in a secular environment. The closer you are to a large urban area, the more secular you probably are. And the closer you are to a university. So if you happen to be in Los Angeles, in a big city near the ocean with a university, or a dozen, forget about it. Okay, that's where you really are. So what we do is we take our students to UC Berkeley, and we know when we get there that they're going to encounter people on the campus who are going to be somewhere on this spectrum. You need to ask enough diagnostic questions to kind of see like where, and we'll talk about one of those in a minute, where are you on that spectrum? And then you're going to do one of these 4 things, right? And so when I teach this to high schoolers, I taught it with Sean McDowell, who is Josh McDowell's son. And we would take these trips up there, and the next week when we would train, before we would go, the next week several of his students would come to our meetings with these t-shirts. We'll pray for group 4. You just start praying. Start praying before you even go. Now, you could pick a jury, but if you pick the jury, we don't just pick a jury, we instruct a jury. As a matter of fact, every case, based on the kind of case it has a specific set of jury instructions. If you've ever served on a trial, you know this is true. They're going to give you those instructions before you go into deliberations so you can actually properly assess the evidence that's been presented to you. It turns out that proper jury instruction is super helpful. It can get you to a verdict a lot faster, right? Because people want to know, well, how do I even assess that? So I'm going to give you some simple jury instructions that'll help you make a case for God and Jesus to people in your world, okay? Same kinds of jury instructions we give jurors. First of all, I get so tired of hearing this claim that there's just no hard evidence for Christianity. There's no hard evidence for God's existence. Well, that's true. Because there's no hard evidence for anything. That's not a category of evidence. We don't have that's like a TV category, I guess, but it's not a real category. Turns out there are only 2 categories of evidence. And once you learn them, you'll see that we have both categories in the Christian worldview. So the first form of evidence is just called direct evidence. It's just eyewitness testimony. Anything you experience on a firsthand basis, you're the eyewitness. That's a direct experience you had of this. If you're an eyewitness, or there's a video, because the lens acts as the eyeball, that is direct evidence. So that is the only other kind of evidence, is unsurprisingly called indirect evidence. Now we've got a name for indirect evidence. It's not just called indirect, but what the categories are is, because the first one's just eyewitness testimony. Indirect evidence is everything else. Everything else is indirect. So if you've got DNA, that's indirect evidence. You've got fingerprints, that's indirect evidence. You've got material evidence linking this, that's all indirect evidence. If it's not an eyewitness, it is indirect. And the word for indirect evidence we use in criminal trials is called circumstantial evidence. When I say that, I already know most of you have a bad notion of what circumstantial evidence is. If I told you I have a great, robust, cumulative circumstantial case for Jesus or for God, you would think, it's just circumstantial. Like that's bad. But it turns out it's not bad evidence, it's very good evidence. Now, the difference is just this. If I have someone who commits a crime, and I have a witness who actually saw him commit the crime and can identify him, she's known him for years, well, her single identification of him as the suspect is a piece of direct evidence. We can make this with one piece of direct evidence, one witness who stands up under cross-examination. That's what direct evidence cases look like. But if you didn't have an eyewitness, well, then you're relying on a collection of other circumstances. If he's lying about his alibi, he happens to possess the right kind of weapon, if he's the one who has a key to get into the building, he's got the right pants that were worn by the suspect. These are the pieces of evidence we start to assemble. He makes some statements that seem a little bit odd for somebody who's supposed to be innocent. Maybe he's wearing a pair of boots that even looks like the boots that we're seeing. These are the things we're looking for. He even has a car that matches a skid mark or matches a tire track. These are the kinds of things that we assemble. Now, you'll notice in order to do an indirect case like this, we have to assemble a large body of evidence. It's called a cumulative circumstantial case. It's cumulative. Now, you can argue, well, isn't it still possible that he's innocent? Yes, of course, anything is possible. That's why our standard is not possible doubt. It's really about whether it's reasonable he's innocent. And the more pieces you have that point to him, the more reasonable it is that he did it. So when you're making a case for something, I don't make it on one piece of evidence. I make it on a bunch of evidence. All of this stuff points to the same reasonable inference. Even though a defense attorney would say, well, I can explain those 8 pieces 8 other ways that are unrelated. Well, was he just terribly unlucky? He happens to have all of these things making him look guilty. That's one possible explanation. Or he just happens to be guilty, and that's why he explains all this evidence so well. He is the one unifying explanation for all of the evidence. That's the more reasonable inference, and we call this kind of case a circumstantial case. I don't have a single case that's a direct evidence case, because cold cases are cold for a reason. If there was a witness who saw it 20 years ago, it would have got solved 20 years ago. My cases are 100% entirely circumstantial. We've never lost a case because we're building them on a cumulative case. So this is what it looks like in cold case Christianity. This is in cold case. So I call this approach basically death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? I mean, any one of these does not feel like a lot. And so when people say, well, how did you discover that Christianity was true? Well, do you have 2 hours? Because it would take me 2 hours to explain to you why Christianity is true, because I built that case on 4 legs. Here they are. This is why I know the Gospels are telling me the truth about Jesus. But that's how am I going to explain all that? And by the way, if I showed you just one little piece on the edges, you would say, well, yeah, it doesn't seem like that much big of a deal. It's death by 1,000 paper cuts. Make sense? So there's never one thing. Now, I will tell you that judges instruct jurors. So if someone says to you, you don't have any hard evidence, you're going to say, well, of course, you don't have any hard evidence for your view either, because hard evidence isn't a category. But there are 2 categories of evidence, direct evidence and indirect evidence. And by the way, Jesus used both. Jesus said that there were witnesses, John the Baptist, his father, who testify about me. And then he even picked a bunch of disciples like Thomas, who he said would eventually be eyewitnesses of the resurrection. Remember, when Thomas comes to him and wants to touch him, wants to see his wounds, he says, Thomas, have at it. And then he says, blessed are those who have not seen this, yet believe. Keep on reading, because they will be listening to your testimony, Thomas. You're here to act as that piece of direct evidence, as all of you are, because you will be testifying about the resurrection. Then read the book of Acts. What's the one way they testify? We've taken that word testimony and we've messed it all up. We think our testimony, share your testimony, how you were transformed by God. Okay, does anyone do that in the book of Acts? No. Testimony is, here's what we saw of the resurrected Christ. The Old Testament predicted it, and then we saw it with our own eyes. That's direct evidence. In other words, they were making a case for the resurrection, not a case for why I'm sober now, why I'm not drinking anymore. I get that's very powerful. It's not a either or, it's a both and. We should be able to do both of these things. We should be able to tell people why Jesus matters to us, how he changed our life, but we should also be able to make a case for why it's true. So judges tell jurors, that's the direct way that Jesus did it. Jesus also used indirect evidence. He said, if you don't believe on the words I'm saying to you, at least believe on the evidence of these miracles I've worked in front of you. That's in Gospel of John, chapter 10, chapter 14. You'll see it over and over again. And what does he do when John's disciples have got questions and they send his disciples to Jesus. John's in custody. He wants to know, are you the one? I can imagine Jesus want to slap him right there, okay? Really? John, my cousin, the dude who baptized me, has got questions now? He saw the Spirit of God descend on me. He leapt in the womb when this is the guy now who's got questions? You tell him to be praying about this. Have a little faith. No, he works miracles in front of John's disciples. He says, go back and tell John what you just said. That's the indirect evidence that he is using to make a case for his deity. Jesus was the consummate evidentialist. So what we have to do is realize that these two forms of evidence, direct evidence and indirect evidence, by jury instruction, are to be given the exact same weight. And jurors are told this by judges in every state in the nation, that direct evidence and indirect evidence, none is of lesser weight than the other. So if all you have was an indirect case, you'd have a strong case. There is a difference in another jury instruction between what's reasonable and what's possible, right? The standard of proof is not beyond a possible doubt, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. That's lower. Anything and everything is possible. You've all had lunch. You probably went to one of these 6 or 7 restaurants that we knew you would go to. And that's why before you got there, we laced all of that restaurant food with this narcotic that basically rendered you useless. You came back to your cars and you passed out. We collected you, put you in incubators, and now you're imagining that you're having this experience collectively. But you really aren't, because we have abducted you into an alien spacecraft, and we're on the way to the mother planet, okay? And while we're there, we're just examining your thoughts to make sure you all think you're in this room. It's like a matrix experience, okay? Now, you could say that's possible, because it is possible. How would I even falsify that claim? Oh, I'll pinch myself. That's part of the illusion. Good for you. How could you falsify this? It turns out that the only way to falsify, you just know. So it's possible, but it's not reasonable. And that's why we make a distinction between what is possible and what is reasonable. The judicial standard is what is reasonable. Make sense? As a matter of fact, judges have in a jury instruction, it says that you are law. I think I'll show it to you later. I could level an imaginary or possible doubt against anything you think you believe. And that's true. Let me give you another jury instruction we use. This is helpful. The reason why I'm showing you this is because people sometimes say, well, I'd have to have no doubts in order to believe Christianity is true. Well, really? What do you think you have no doubts about? There's nothing you think you know you have no doubts about. I mean, anything is possible. Look, every day someone goes out into a car in America somewhere, puts a key in their ignition, turns the ignition, and it blows up in the driveway. Mechanical error, something's wrong. That's possible. It could happen to you today. Are you going to live your life based on what you think is possible? No, you'd be frozen in place. You live your life based on what you think is reasonable. That's a lower standard. That's an okay standard. That's a standard we use in criminal trials where we're going to execute people. If it's good enough to use there, you can use it in these kinds of decisions. Make sense? So help people to realize their standard is probably too high. As a matter of fact, they'll always say this: I have unanswered questions, therefore I can't believe something is true. Really? Can you believe something is true even if you have unanswered questions? I should hope so, because I have never been able to answer every question that a jury has. We'll even ask potential jurors, are you the kind of person who needs to have every question answered before you can render a verdict? Yeah, I think I am that kind of person. Well, then you're excused. Can't put you on a jury, because I'm not going to be able to answer all your questions. I can't even answer my own questions on this. I can usually make a case for that he did it, but I can't always tell you how he did it. I'm not even sure how, unless he confesses to this, and I've had a number of those guys do that. We'll make an offer. We'll give you a plea. We'll take off the death penalty if you'll just tell us how you did it. Because we want to see is, we have an idea, but we want to know, are we right? So he'll tell us eventually how he did it. I had a case a number of years ago in which a man did on a bunch of these. We'll talk about one of these tomorrow night. No body murders, right? Where you have somebody who kills their wife and they claim that she ran off. And so I had this case. I've said several of these. This was a Dateline case also, where this guy, kills his wife, gets rid of the body successfully, and now I got to figure out what's about 30 years later, how do I do this? And we convicted this guy, but we never found the body, and he never confessed to it. So when we convicted him, years later, basically because he would change his story. I remember we were at the taping for the Dateline, and Keith is the guy who was, you know what Keith Morrison is? He's on Dateline, big white hair guy. He's hilarious. Anyway, he was like, oh, this is the one you got wrong. There's no way he did this. Nobody believed he did this. His family, of course, doesn't believe he did it. But her family also didn't believe he did it. Nobody believed because we had such a little bit of evidence to make this case, but we did convict him. Well, then at the sentencing hearing, he decided he was going to confess to it, hoping to reduce his sentence. So at sentencing, he confesses to it. But keep in mind, when we convicted this guy, we could not answer the most important questions a jury wants to know. How did he kill her? Where did he put the body? How did he do it on a night where the 2 kids were in the next room? And then how did he move her car to get it off how did he get back to the house? I couldn't answer any of those questions. Don't know how he did it. But I knew that he did it, and that was enough. So are you the kind of person who think, I can't believe there's a God, I can't believe Christianity is true because I can't answer every question? Well, I'm going to take that burden from you. Because you can't answer every question about any worldview you think you're an atheist? You're an atheist who has a worldview? Really? How did the universe originate? Why does it appear to be fine-tuned? How does life originate in that universe? Why does biology appear to be designed? Why do we have consciousness or free agency? How do we have transcendent moral norms or moral laws? Where do these things come from? Trust me, if you're an atheist, you have more unanswered questions than we do. But you still hold to this because you don't think you have to have every question answered. And we ask this is what we say in the jury instructions. The evidence need not eliminate all possible doubt because everything in life is open to some possible or imaginary doubt. Tell the people you're talking to this is true for their worldview too, because it is. Let me think here. I want to talk about witnesses because sometimes we're basing this on witnesses and you'll see that the Gospels don't agree. How do I deal with this? Well, it turns out that witnesses never agree. On any case I've had, witnesses have never agreed. The reason why I thought the Gospels were interesting enough to investigate is because I read them for the first time and I realized these folks don't agree. And the level of their disagreement is about what you'd expect from 4 eyewitnesses. So I said, let me examine these under that template that I showed you when I first started. That's what started all this for me, the fact that they don't agree. Because this is so common with eyewitnesses. Eyewitnesses just don't agree. So I have one question that I typically ask of the dispatcher when they call me out in the middle of the night to go to a homicide. It's only one question I ask. Here it is. Is there officers on the scene? Because if there are officers who are on the scene, I want you to do, of course there are going to be, do me a favor, have the officers separate all the eyewitnesses. This is my only request before I come. I'll take care of everything else, but just have the officers separate the eyewitnesses. And the reason why we do that is because if you don't separate them, they will say exactly the same thing. But if you do separate them, you'll get what appear to be contradictory statements that you can then puzzle together to get the richest, most robust version of what actually happened. Does that make sense? If you've ever worked a case, you know this is true. The problem we have is that a lot of people who are doing history, in Christian history, have never interviewed eyewitnesses. And you start to kind of contort yourself trying to figure out how to explain the differences in accounts. But if you've interviewed eyewitnesses, you will stop that. Let me give you an example. So we have a robbery. I get there, and they've separated some eyewitnesses. I talk to the first eyewitness, and this first eyewitness says, okay, he wore a white t-shirt and jeans, and his hair was short, and he yelled a lot. Okay, so there's the first statement. Now, it's clear that if I just let her ramble and say, tell me what you saw, and she tells me these 3 things, it turns out she is really trying to answer 3 questions I haven't really even asked yet, which are, what did he wear? What does he look like? And what did he say? Get to the second eyewitness. They've been separated. He says, well, he wore a t-shirt and jeans, and his hair was blonde, and he demanded money. Well, there's some new information here. Even though this guy is still just trying to answer the same 3 categories of evidence, he's answering them slightly differently. Does that make sense? But he is still in the same 3 categories. So I get my third witness. He says, well, he wore a short sleeve shirt and jeans. He was white. That's new details. And he screamed at the clerk. Okay. Again, though, he is at least providing information in the same 3 categories. Well, you may have noticed this guy kind of standing in the wings there. You can barely see him here. Well, if I didn't realize there's a 4th witness and he's been allowed to hear what the other 3, I didn't think he was a witness. He's been standing there. I figured the officers have separated these guys. This guy clearly can't be a witness because the officers would have taken him aside. But no, they didn't take him aside. So now he's heard everything that the other 3 witnesses have told me. Well, now I'm like, I got to interview this guy. So he comes in and he says something. He says he's a regular customer. And afterwards he ran it. But this is like, you realize that he is not answering the same 3 categories that the other ones did. He's given me two completely different categories of information. So why is he doing this? Well, the reason why he's doing it is because he's aware of what the other three said in the other three categories. So it turns out that your order of witnesses does change what you should expect from each witness, especially if they're aware of what other witnesses have already said. Does that make sense? It's not that hard to figure out. So when we get to the Gospels, we have something that's similar that happens. So you take a look at some of the earliest versions, for example, of the Lord's Supper. You get early Gospel witnesses like Mark, who will put it like this. As they were reclining at the table and eating, Jesus said, "Truly I say to you that one of you will betray me." Now, interestingly, in this description, it seems that the Gospel author is trying to answer two questions, and here they are. The questions are, where were they and what did Jesus say? But the next witness comes in, someone like Matthew, and he'll say something like this. As they were eating, he said, "Truly I say to you that one of you will betray me." Kind of similar. And again, what is he doing? He's answering the same two questions the first gospel author is writing. Get to someone like Luke, for example, and it gets a little bit different. "But behold, the hand of the one betraying me is with mine on the table." That's interesting, but he is still answering the same two questions. And then you get to someone like John, and suddenly this thing is like, gets really weird and wanky, right? It's like, hey, there was reclining on Jesus' bosom one of his disciples, whom Jesus loved. So when he had dipped the morsel, he took it and gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. And after that morsel, Satan then entered into him. Therefore, Jesus said to him, "What you do, do quickly." That's a lot more information than anyone else has ever given us, and it's not even in the same categories of questions. He's answering not this two questions like everybody else. He's answering two entirely different questions. Why is he doing that? Well, now you know. Because the order of witnesses, John is clearly aware of what everyone else says about the Lord's Supper. And the last witness in is more than likely, unless you stop and redirect them, they're more than likely just going to fill in the gaps for you. They're going to answer questions that the other three don't even ask because they know they've already been asked and answered. And you see this throughout John's gospel because he is the last gospel author and he's clearly aware of the synoptics. That should not wig you out. That's just how witnesses act. Does that make sense? By the way, you know, a witness can be wrong and still be reliable. I'm not suggesting that any of the gospel witnesses are wrong, but even if they were, it wouldn't be an argument against them. I'm not suggesting they're wrong. I don't think there's actually a contradiction anywhere in Scripture. This is just the kinds of differences that you see between eyewitness accounts. Every single one of these, I see them. I've had a case, for example, here's a case, I think from 1984-ish. It was at Kentucky Fried Chicken. Someone was killed here. If you look at these images on this book, it happens at this restaurant, and the police are gathered around a woman who's talking to them. This woman who's pictured in the bottom here, she said that she was working that night, the next morning rather. The night before, she had traded shifts with a coworker. So she was going to work in the morning now. The coworker was going to work at night. Well, it turned out on the night that she was supposed to work, her coworker was murdered. The next morning, she comes back to work and she discovers the coworker. And from the minute she entered the parking lot, she knew something was weird because the coworker's car. Do you guys know what a Datsun B210 is? Now you know you're old if you know what a Datsun is. Forget about the B210. So anyway, this car was parked in the parking lot. That belonged to the victim. And she thought right away she knew something was wrong. She had that bad feeling on the back of her neck. She ran to the door. She opened the door. She went inside and she found the victim on the floor. She had been stabbed to death. For 30 years, she always thought that should have been her. And she thought about it quite a bit. Now, when we got to trial, the real question was, we wanted to know if this guy was potentially a coworker of our victim. And so we wanted to know, was that door you entered, was that door locked or unlocked? Did you have to use a key to get in? It became a big deal. And she thought the door, she couldn't remember. She said it went one way and she was just wrong. So Karen was absolutely mistaken about the locked door. And of course, the defense attorney just went after her. If she's wrong about this, why should you trust anything else she says about what she first saw? I mean, this is an important deal. And she can't really? So we have to ask the question, well, okay, can I explain why she might not have remembered that? I mean, after all, from the moment she entered the parking lot, she was not thinking about anything but what is this car doing in the parking lot? I don't think she was thinking about anything from the point of the car all the way to the body. And so clearly, anything that happens between the car and the body, she has not got a good memory about. I get that. Well, the jury figured it out too. So the jury determined that she was reliable, even though she was wrong about the door. And there's a jury instruction for this. A witness can be mistaken about a particular detail and yet be considered reliable. So even if, I'm not suggesting this is the case, but just for sake of argument, if you thought, well, these witnesses are wrong about something, you still would not have adequate warrant to toss it to the curb. And the jury instruction will look something like this in the state of California, so you can see what we tell jurors. Do not automatically reject testimony just because of inconsistencies or conflicts. Consider whether the differences are important or not. People sometimes honestly forget things or make mistakes about what they remember. Also, two people may witness the same event yet see or hear it differently. We tell this to jurors in criminal trials. You need to be able to communicate this to people who are skeptical about these eyewitness accounts. But I think you can actually resolve every alleged contradiction without having to claim that it's an error. But just for the sake of argument, even if it was, it would not invalidate them. Let me give you another one. There's a difference between a fact and an inference. A fact and an inference. This is important in this culture today. So what I mean by this is that we have facts we bring into a trial, and then we have a verdict we're going to render at the end of this entire thing, an inference that we're going to reach on the basis of the facts we were given in the trial. And I wish it was so simple that we would just present the facts and everyone would come to the same verdict, right? Like if we just gave them the right instructions, these jury instructions, we'll just give them the jury instructions, and if we do this well, they'll all come to the same verdict. But the truth of it is, you can get the same facts and the same instructions, yet get to different conclusions. Well, why? Because it turns out that what decides this is stuff like how you're wired. People are sometimes wired skeptically or glass half empty or glass half full people. It's also whatever memories you've had of your own experience, your own background. You bring that to every decision you make. It's the things that you prefer and like. It's where your heart lies. In other words, there are a lot more factors that go into making a decision than just the facts. This is why sometimes people come, and this is really what all decision making, unfortunately, is based in a lot of these predispositions we have. So this is why you can offer a set of facts. It's kind of like you're in that car, you want to get to a certain destination, and it turns out that people end up at different places. Why are they in different places? Because that's the stuff that is making their decisions. This is also true for us when we think about Jesus, when we think about God, when we think about the facts for God, the evidence for God. Look at it this way. So there's some biological evidence, let's say some scientific evidence, and then it turns out that somebody who says, I think the best explanation for that scientific evidence is some form of naturalism involving Darwinian evolution. Yet I can look at the exact same evidence, which I do in a book called God's Crime Scene, exact same evidence that these folks are using, but I think the better inference from the exact same evidence is design. Well, how is it we're using the exact same evidence and arriving at two different conclusions? You already guessed it. It's all that stuff. Now, we have to be careful, too, that we don't want something to be true so much that it clouds the way we examine the evidence. So we come to a false inference because we just are allowing our biases to dictate. We have to be as neutral as possible. And by the way, when you select a jury, no one is neutral. No one is neutral. Everyone has an opinion. We're just trying to get rid of the edges. So you're either going to be a 2 or a 3. We're all that way. That's okay. 2 or 3s are good enough. It's just if you're a 1 or a 4, you can't do this because your background. So in the end, here's what I'd like to say. You see this expression all the time: settled science. As if the conclusion that Darwinian evolution is true is now settled science, or that gender theory is settled science. Okay, there is no such thing as settled science. It's like an oxymoron. The whole scientific project is discovering something you think is true on the basis of evidence, and then changing your assumptions, changing your inferences based on new evidence. Science, this inference is never settled. Now, you might argue over here that there are some facts that are settled. Well, yeah, if I walk in, there's certain fingerprints in the crime scene. Well, I can't change those. That's just the facts of what was in the crime scene. That, for the most part, is settled. But what I infer from those facts is going to depend on a lot of other things. That's not settled. So I would say that the facts could be settled, but the inferences are never settled. That's something that new evidence could come. So this is an inference. It's not a settled piece of science. Does that make sense? Have you ever heard somebody say, you know what? That burden of proof is on you guys. Do you think there's a God that doesn't exist? I don't see God. Therefore, if you're going to posit that there's something imaginary out there that I can't see, that burden to prove that that imaginary thing exists is yours. You're the only one who have the burden of proof. The default position is atheism, therefore I have no burden to prove it. I have to prove there isn't a God. It's clear from these folks' perspective there isn't a God. So the question is, you have to prove the existence of something we don't see. Well, it turns out that burden of proof is largely misunderstood. So the burden of proof is applied to the cause. We're all trying to figure out what the best explanation for causes is. Let me give it to you this way. So we go to a crime scene, and I'm standing with my partner, and I got 5 partners in a homicide team. I have to have every 5th homicide is mine. So I've got 4 other partners. They get the other homicides, right? So you won't have to do every 5th homicide. So if I'm standing, but we all get called out to the same ones. It's just that so one of us is going to be the IO, the investigating officer. The rest are going to act like they care when they don't, okay? But they're standing there with you just to kind of be a pain in your butt, okay? Because they're just going to needle you the whole time, mock you the whole time, be totally unuseful, and then laugh at you if it goes unsolved, okay? So there's nothing good about this, all right? So you're standing there with your partners, and you'll look across the crime scene, and you'll say, okay, I see some evidence in the crime scene here. And so I will say, I think from this evidence that the coworker is the best inference from the evidence. Now, I can tell my partners, just because they're jerks, will say, oh, you're so full of it. It's not that. It's some other cause. So let's say my partner says, no, it's the girlfriend, just because he loves to play devil's advocate. Well, I have a burden because I'm offering as a cause the coworker. I have a burden to show how this evidence is best explained by a coworker. But he's making a claim. He's saying the best cause for this is the girlfriend. Therefore, he has the burden of showing how the evidence best implicates a girlfriend. Well, something similar happens when we're looking at evidence in the universe, right? So like I said, there is things about the universe that have to be explained by everyone. And I talk about this in this book, God's Crime Scene. And so I'll just give you the 8 that I mentioned in the book. We have the beginning of the universe. We have the fine-tuning of the universe. We actually have the origin of life in the universe, the appearance of design and biology. We have consciousness we have to explain somehow. And free agency is something you got to explain also in a deterministic worldview. Also, we have objective transcendent moral truths. And finally, we have the existence of evil that we all have to figure out how we best explain evil. These are the 8 things that are in the universe that every one of us has to explain. Now, I'm going to come up and say to you, like in God's crime scene, if I'm an atheist, I'm going to deny that there's a God. So if I'm an atheist, he's going to say, well, I can get all 8 of those things with just space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry, entirely natural causes. No God necessary, because I can get these 8 things with just space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry. Now, I look at those 8 things and I'm thinking, no, the best inference is that this is a divine mind who is the originator and creator of these 8 features of the universe. Now, I have a burden as the theist to explain why a divine mind is the best explanation for these 8 features of the universe, because burden comes down to describing a cause. I say the cause is God. But if you think the cause, there is no God, well, then you still have to have a cause. You think the cause is space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry, and you shoulder an equal burden to show me how space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry can get me those 8 things. We both have a burden because burdens are related to causal explanations. Are we clear on this? Both sides have a burden. So if someone says that burden is yours, make sure you shift it and say, well, you think you can get all this with just space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry. That burden is yours. And I think of the 2 of us, that's a much more difficult burden to shoulder. Because we're going to run out of time here, I'm just going to jump over to something else I want to talk to you about before I let you go to the next session, because I think it's important. I want you to learn how to make a case enthusiastically, because it turns out that there's a relationship when it comes to enthusiasm that's helpful to learn. So John's very enthusiastic, and people will say this about him, right? They'll say how he's passionate. They'll say that he is fearless. This is all stuff in the LA Times. He's enthusiastic. Well, why is he enthusiastic? Well, it's not that he's any of these things, because I know John. He's not any of those things. But he is the most prepared district attorney I have ever worked with. And there's a relationship between preparation and enthusiasm. They see the enthusiasm, but it turns out it's grounded in preparation. So you know this, you've experienced this yourself. When you were in college or in high school and you had a classroom in physics, let's say, and they put a test on the wall, there's going to be a test on Friday. Right? Then the test day comes and you walk into that classroom and there's some idiot in that classroom who's just really excited that today is test day. Have you ever known a guy like this? I have. And I'm not that guy. I'm like the other people in that classroom, right? Don't really want to do this. Well, why is he enthusiastic? Because he's an idiot. But aside from being an idiot, he's enthusiastic because he's studied up for this. Like he's prepared for the test. This is the day he gets to kick your butt and make fun of you because he actually studied. So he's prepared. This makes a difference. And the rest of us are not so prepared. Well, this is why if I said to you, okay, the rest of this conference, we've canceled it. We're just going to go downtown. We're going to go to Charlotte. And we're going to go on the streets. We're going to find a place in Charlotte. And we're just going to do some street preaching. And you're not going to be allowed to go home until you successfully do some street preaching. Most of you would say, I'm not going to do that. But you're not going to be like this guy. This guy, though, he's ready to go. Why is he ready to go? Because he is prepared. It's simply a matter of preparation. So the question is, what can you do to get prepared for that first encounter? So here's what I would suggest to you. Look, the biggest wall you jump in the evangelism jump is the first wall. It's just jumping the first wall. It's scary. You have to learn how to jump it. It's just about how do you overcome that first few seconds. So I'm going to tell you the best thing to do is just have a thing you've memorized that you're going to say. That's your elevator speech. You're just going to use it no matter who you encounter. I've got friends who do this. A guy named James Burcardo, he wrote a book called Unsilenced, and here's what he says. And it seems awkward at first, but remember, you just need to say something to get past the barrier of fear. So he'll say, regardless of where he's at, who he's with, he'll say, so what do you think happens when you die? He's like, hey, I'm John. Good to meet you. What do you think happens, or he's James, what do you think happens when you die? That seems like an awkward question to ask, but agnostic. If someone says, well, I think you go in the dirt, you kind of know their worldview. Oh, I think you're reincarnated. You kind of know their worldview. I think you go to heaven. You don't necessarily know their worldview from that question. They may have some pseudo-Christian cultural view of heaven. Who knows? But it kind of prepares you to know where you're going to go next. And I guarantee you, as awkward as this first sentence may sound, they are going to respond. And then it's going to feel like it's really easy. Because now you're just in a conversation. Jump the first wall. I've got another friend named Grover in Montana. He does it slightly different. He'll say, I see you're wearing a watch. You know, watches are designed for a purpose. What's your purpose? That's a great opening line because it's also diagnostic. Purpose really is grounded in a theistic worldview, or it's just a matter of subjective opinion. It gives you places to go. Jump the first wall. My suggestion to you tonight is ask yourself, what are you going to say if you had just one line to start a conversation? And you might say, well, it's going to be painful. Yeah, it's going to be painful. Get over it. I know we're in a generation where you can't say that, right? Because it feels like every time I talk to officers who are involved in shootings, my first thing I want to say is rub some dirt in it. I hate to say that. Dude, if you do this job, yeah, you're going to end up getting shot at. You're going to end up killing somebody. It ain't going to be fun. Rub some dirt in it. Get on. You can't quit. Somebody's got to do the job. So trust me, what you're about to do by sharing the gospel is not nearly as painful. Do it. I'll finish with this. How do you make a closing argument? Have you ever noticed in a dog yard, when you go into a dog yard, it's kind of wild. You have all these different kinds of dogs in the yard. And you know that the dog that's the nastiest little pain in the butt that you want to kick is the Chihuahua, right? I know some of you have Chihuahuas, okay, because you're stupid. But aside from that, I had a Chihuahua once, but I'm not stupid anymore, so I got rid of it, okay? But Chihuahuas are the nastiest little dogs. They make a lot of noise. I guarantee you this, the big dogs in the yard aren't making any noise. And you know why? Because they are confident of their position in the yard. The Chihuahua is not confident of his position in the yard. He cannot intimidate by size. He tries to intimidate by volume. Well, think about it. If you're the big dog in the yard of worldviews, why would you sound like a Chihuahua? If you are a Christian theist, you have the big dog of worldviews. Your worldview makes the most sense out of reality. If you've studied your worldview, it is the big dog of worldviews. Yet, most of us sound like we hold the Chihuahua's view. You got to stop that. That's a fight or flight thing, right? We don't have to fight or flight. We can calmly strut in the worldview arena and make a case for what we believe. So I want you to start thinking about yourself this way. And I want you to be confident because it turns out you're not alone. It's not a game of baseball. I mean, a game of tennis, right? It's a game of baseball. We start off with one person making the case. She's got lots of help. She's also got people, if she's a district attorney, she's got people who are the paralegal staff that's also working with her. She's got detectives who are working with her and police officers who can run down witnesses. She's got people who are involved in the forensic sciences who can help her. This is the team she has. She has all this team. So she's playing baseball. And that's what we do as Christians who are making the case for Christianity. You know, in tennis, it's a little different. You hit the ball on one side of the net, they hit the ball back. If I hit it out of bounds, it's only on me. I'm the only reason why we fail. If we win, it's because of me. If we lose, it's because of me. That's tennis, but that's not baseball. Baseball's a team sport, and you're involved in a team sport. So I just want you to start thinking about it that way, right? Your tendency is to think, I have to share the gospel with somebody, and I have to hit it out of the park. I'm not successful unless they accept Christ as Lord right there on that day in front of you. And if you're on a mission trip, that feels like the pressure is even higher, right? Like, I'm out to do what? I'm sharing Jesus. If it's your family member, you're thinking, I'm only going to be successful if I hit this kind of a home run. So you're constantly swinging for the fences. And that's the problem. That's not how, well, anymore, it kind of is how baseball is won these days, because baseball's changed in the last 20 years. But it used to be that what you tried to do in baseball was advance runners. Not everyone was hitting home runs. So the idea is somehow to get a guy on first to get over to second, or on third to get him home. The goal here is you don't know where the people in your life are when it comes to the gospel. They might already be on first, and you might spend time with them and just advance them to second, and that would be a win. Or maybe that for 5 years they stood on second until somebody said something that advanced them to third, and then you're going to come along and say something that sends them home. Now, what's helpful about this analogy is that if you're somebody who feels like, I never see this happen, stop beating yourself up. You don't know what good you're doing. You are advancing runners. You just don't know how far you're advancing them. So celebrate this. Your goal is to move people around the base track. And also, if you're somebody who shares the gospel and someone becomes a Christian right in front of you, relax, dude. That wasn't all you. It ain't all about you. That dude was on third base leaning in. You basically hit this bunt that was, you're out at first, but he happened to come home. So get over yourself, okay? This is what we're doing when it comes to evangelism. And the last thing before I send you. Look, we are called in Scripture sheep. And that is not a compliment. We are referred to as sheep because sheep are stupid, dirty animals. They don't even know they have a predator problem. They don't even know that there are wolves trying to pick them off. They're not even smart enough to know that. And there are wolves out there that are trying to pick them off. And we see this right now in culture. We see this also in Christianity. Now, there's another canine in the yard with the sheep and the wolf. That canine is called a sheepdog. That sheepdog is there to protect the sheep from the wolves. The sheep don't even like the canine. They don't like the sheepdog either because they can't see the difference between these two kinds of canines. And they often see the sheepdog as a wolf. The reality of it is, though, the sheepdogs are there for a purpose. If we had a yard full of sheepdogs, we would not have a wolf problem. Our job is to help move you from sheep to sheepdog. That's why we do these conferences, is to move you from one category to the other. So my question is, before you leave here tomorrow, what kind of sheepdog are you? There's a difference. We run trails in California. This is the idea of one of our trails. There's some beautiful trails in Southern California. And we were on one of these trails, and on the post, I kid you not, there was a poster for a lost dog. A little Chihuahua thingy, whatever the heck that is. When I saw that, I had to laugh about this, okay? If that's your dog and it's lost, I mean, if you got a Great Dane, well, you don't even have that thing on there, right? Because you don't need to worry about your Great Dane. Look, if you're looking for your lost Chihuahua on this trail, I can tell you where to find it. It's in the middle of the trail in that coyote poop right there. That's your dog, okay? Now, if you're looking for your Great Dane, just find the nearest kennel, because that's where the dog is, okay? Because this is the difference. You got to make a decision, folks. And you got to help everybody else who's in the church make this decision too. What kind of sheepdog are you? What kind of sheepdog are you going to be? That is what we're here to do. And we're here to answer your questions, but we're also here to make sure that you are prepared to be the best kind of sheepdog you can be. Let's pray. Father, we know that we can do a better job, and we are so distracted by a bunch of stuff that doesn't matter. Would you just help us to be more focused and less distracted by the things that don't matter? Help us to be geeked out on this and trust you to take us all the way home. We pray this in the name of your precious Son, Jesus Christ. And everyone here says, Amen. Okay, great. Thanks, guys. We have a little bit of a break. We'll come back in here for the next plenary.